This video will demonstrate how to install .NET Core on Ubuntu Linux. Then, I will set up the tooling to create ASP.NET Core applications. Finally, I will build a simple ASP.NET Core application with Entity Framework Core using Visual Studio Code as the IDE. This is an Ubuntu Linux 16.04 virtual machine that is just finished installing. I've taken the liberty of modifying a few configurations to match my personal preferences, such as the color theme of the terminal and installing Google Chrome as the default browser. Other than that, nothing else has been installed. So I'm going to start the installation process by running sudo apt update in the terminal. apt has updated the package listings to the latest sources. After that, I'm going to install Git because one of the tools used in generating the ASP.NET Core templates will require it. Next, I'm going to open a new browser window and go to .NET. This is the home page for all things .NET. I'm going to scroll down to the Download Now button for .NET Core, click on it, and I'll be taken to the instruction page for installing .NET Core. Since I'm using Ubuntu, I'll click on Linux and then Ubuntu. And then I'll scroll down to the instructions for my version, which is 16.04. There are several commands that must be run to install .NET Core on Linux, and I'm just going to copy and paste them into the terminal. The first command adds a new source to the apt package listings. This source will tell apt where to look for packages to install .NET Core. The next command will install a key which apt uses to validate the integrity of the downloaded packages. The last command will update the package listing again, this time including the new source added in the first step. Now it is time to install .NET Core with the command in step 2. There are two other steps on this page that show you how to verify .NET Core is installed by generating and building a simple Hello World command line app. However, I'm going to skip that in the interest of time because the goal of this video is a web application with ASP.NET Core and Entity Framework Core. But to make sure that the installation worked, I'll go ahead and run .NET at the command line, and if there are no errors and it shows the usage info, then everything is fine. To create a new ASP.NET Core application, I'm going to use a tool called Yeoman that will generate a skeleton ASP.NET Core template. Yeoman is written in JavaScript and targets the Node.js framework, so I need to install that next. I prefer to use a tool called NVM for Node Version Manager to install Node.js. NVM will let me install multiple versions of Node side by side, and then I can choose which version is the active or default version. First of all, I need to go to the GitHub repo page for NVM. So if I do a Google for Creationix NVM, I'll find the home page. And what I'll do is I'll scroll down to the section marked Install Script. I'll copy this first command to fetch and install NVM using curl, and then I'll paste it into the terminal and run it. After the script is done, I'll need to restart my terminal as the installation script modified my bash startup scripts. In a new terminal, I'll run the command nvm ls-remote to list the Node.js versions available. Scrolling up, I'll see that the latest version is 4.4.7. I'm going to run the command nvm install 4.4.7 to download and install Node.js 4.4.7. Also, notice that the installer automatically created an alias and set it to point at the version of Node just installed. This will make Node.js 4.4.7 available whenever a new terminal is opened. Before installing Yeoman, I'll upgrade npm, which is the Node Package Manager. This will help to prevent errors later on. So I'll run the command npm install -g npm. Now this will use npm to install the latest version of npm, thus upgrading it. Next, I can install Yeoman and a few other dependencies. I can use npm to do this as well. The -g flag means to install the Node packages and make them available globally anywhere on the machine, as opposed to a specific Node application. The Yo package is the Yeoman engine. Bower is a tool similar to npm, except it manages front-end dependencies such as Bootstrap and jQuery. The Grunt CLI and Gulp packages are part of the build process. Then is the generator ASP.NET package. While Yeoman is the engine that will generate the ASP.NET Core application template, it needs a generator to tell it what to generate, and this is the generator for ASP.NET Core applications. With these packages installed, I can generate the template for the ASP.NET Core application. First, I'll create and cd to a directory for all of my ASP.NET Core projects. I'll call it ASP.NET PRJS. Next, I'll start Yeoman with the command yo and pass it the generator I want to use, which is ASP.NET. The first time Yeoman runs, it will ask for permission to collect and send statistics about usage. I'll hit enter to accept this, and then the options menu will appear. I want to create a web application basic. This will generate an ASP.NET Core application with some simple content. It will not, however, have Entity Framework installed. The web application by itself would, because it comes with membership and authorization enabled, and that requires Entity Framework. I want to start from the beginning. Next, Yeoman will ask me what UI framework I want to use. I'll just select Bootstrap because I know what that is. And finally, it's going to ask for a name. I'm going to use Conference Barrel because this is going to be the beginning of an application that will manage a catalog of events. Yeoman will then generate the files for the ASP.NET Core application and start Bower to pull down and install the front-end libraries like Bootstrap and jQuery. Now I need an editor. The best ASP.NET Core experience on Linux is going to come from Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is a free, cross-platform, and open-source text editor inspired by Visual Studio. It is available for download at code.visualstudio.com. I'm going to select the .deb package for Ubuntu, and the file will start to download. I'm going to tell Chrome to keep the file, and then I'm going to go back to the terminal. I'm going to open a new tab, and I'm going to cd to the downloads directory. Here is the .deb file that I just downloaded, and I can install it with sudo dpkg -i. I'll type code, hit tab to complete the file name, and press enter. It wants my password, and now it will do the installation. Now I can close this terminal, cd to the Conference Barrel directory in the other one, and type code dot to open the application in Visual Studio Code. I'll also right-click on the Visual Studio Code icon and lock it to the launcher. And I'll close this Chrome window. It's almost time to start to write some code. First, there's an extension that I should install to take advantage of code completion and other features of Visual Studio Code. First, I'll press Ctrl-Shift-P to open the command palette. Then I'll type ext. The first command in the list will be install extensions. Clicking on this will open the extensions sidebar, and the default will be showing the most popular extensions. The first one is the C# extension that I want to install. So I'll click the install button, and then I'll click the enable button. Visual Studio Code will need to restart, so I'll press OK. After the restart, it will download and install the .NET Core debugger. It will also be able to detect unresolved dependencies in the project.json file in Conference Barrel and automatically restore them. This can take a while the first time, but future runs will be much quicker. I'll just speed this one up through the magic of video. Visual Studio also wants to add some assets to support building and debugging the project, so I'll add those as well. There are a number of packages that Entity Framework Core needs, which are not included in project.json, so I'll have to add them. I already have these in a file that I can cut and paste from. Even though I'm not typing all of this out, it is worth mentioning that Visual Studio Code supports code completion for JSON files that it understands the structure of, including the project.json file. I'll copy these first 3 dependencies into the dependencies section, and then the last package into the tools section. When I save the project.json file, Visual Studio Code will detect that it needs to restore the packages I just added. Now it's time to write some application code. I'm going to create some model classes, so I'll follow convention and create a models directory in the Conference Barrel application. And I can do this inside of Visual Studio Code by right-clicking and selecting New Folder. And I'll name it Models. Inside of the Models directory, I'll create 2 new files that will hold model classes. The first class will be conference.cs, and the second one will be session.cs. The conference class will have a list of sessions or presentations, and each session will belong to a conference. Now these classes are very similar to how Entity Framework models were written in prior versions, so I'm not going to labor over the details, and there aren't that many details because they are so simple. However, I want to demonstrate the features of the Visual Studio Code editor, so I'm still going to live code this. In Conference CS, I'll add a namespace of conferencebuilder.models. Typing name and pressing tab will generate a namespace and put the cursor on the name of the namespace so I can continue typing. Pressing enter will put the cursor inside of the curly braces. And now I can do something similar to create a conference class. I need to add some properties. The first one is going to be an integer, which will be the ID of the conference, and I can use a code snippet to help with this. So typing prop and hitting tab will expand into a public property with an auto getter and setter. The type is highlighted, so I can enter a new one, or hit tab to accept the current one, which is what I will do. Now the name is highlighted, and I'm going to change it to ID, and press enter to complete the property. I'm going to add 2 more properties. The first one is going to be a string, which will be the name of the conference, and then also a decimal value, which will represent the ticket price. That's all for the conference class for the moment, so I'm going to save it and move to session.cs. In session.cs, I'll also add the conference barrel.models namespace, and inside the namespace I'll add a class named session. I'm also going to add an int property of ID, and I'll also add a string which will represent the title of the session. Finally, I'm going to add a foreign key and navigation property to refer back to the conference that this class belongs to. And now I can save session.cs. Now I need to go back to the conference class and add a property for the sessions that belong to this conference. Now this is going to be a list of session, so first I need to add a using for system.collections.generic, and then I could add my property. Okay, now I need a database context class to talk between the models and the database. I'm going to create another new file inside of the models directory, and I'm going to call it application db context. Again, I'll add the namespace, and I'll add the class application db context. Now this is going to derive from a class called dbContext. The dbContext class is in the Microsoft.EntityFramework core namespace, and Visual Studio detected this. I'm going to put my cursor on the dbContext class with the red squiggly, and then I'll click this light bulb. A menu will come up, and the last option will be to import the Microsoft.EntityFramework core namespace. The namespace will be added to the top of the file, and the red squiggly will disappear. Now I need to add two dbSet properties which will represent the tables of the types of the models. dbSet also comes from the Microsoft.EntityFramework core namespace. Finally, the database requires one configuration setting. Configuration in Entity Framework Core is done in code, so I'm going to override the onConfiguring method. Inside of the method, I'll tell Entity Framework Core that I will be using SQLite as the database. SQLite is a local file-based database that is great for development as it requires little setup. On Windows with Visual Studio, we might use SQL Server Local DB, but that doesn't exist on Linux, at least not yet. So SQLite will work out well for now. I'm just going to use this method to set the path of the database file, and it's going to be stored relative to the compiled assemblies for this application. With the model code complete, the next step is to create the database. Now this is done with a migration. In Visual Studio on Windows, migrations are handled using the PowerShell console, but Entity Framework Core makes use of the .NET CLI again. So first I'll return to the console window, and then to create the first migration, which will also create the database, I'll run the command .NET EF migrations add initial, where initial is an arbitrary name for the migration. In Visual Studio Code, notice that a migrations folder has been added to the project. Inside of it is a C# file that instructs Entity Framework Core how to perform the modifications to the database. There is an up method which applies the migration that creates the tables, and there is also a down method that rolls back the migration and drops the tables. To apply the migration, use the .NET CLI again, and I can see that the migration was applied. Now in Visual Studio Code, I'll look in the bin folder in the project, and inside of the debug and then .NET Core App 1.0 folders, there is a database file, confbarrel.db. Now Visual Studio cannot display this file, so I'm going to inspect it with the SQLite 3 command line tool. But first, this has to be installed. So going back to the command line, I'll run the command sudo apt install SQLite 3. I'm going to cd into the directory where the database file is located. Next, I'm going to run the command SQLite 3 confbarrel-db, and this will bring up the SQLite 3 command prompt. I want to get a list of tables in the database, and I can do this with the .tables command. And here are the two tables for the DB sets for conferences and sessions that were created in the application DB context. So now I'll press Ctrl D to exit SQLite 3. Next, I'm going to write some code to access the models. Now what I'm going to do is very simple. I'm just going to add an action method to the home controller that will create a conference and add some sessions to it. Then it will redirect to another action which will query the database for that conference and render a view with the conference name and the titles of its sessions. My goal here is not to build a complete application, but rather to show how Entity Framework Core works. So back in Visual Studio Code, I'm going to open up Home Controller in the Controllers folder. And the first thing I'm going to need is an instance of a database context, so I will add one to the home controller. Since application DB context is in the conference barrel.models namespace, I'll put the cursor over the context class, click the light bulb, and import the namespace. Now I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of the file. I'll add another action method, and notice that it returns iActionResult instead of ActionResult like in previous versions of ASP.NET. I'll call the method createConference. Now the next part of the code is really no different than it would be in previous versions of Entity Framework. Notice that instead of typing out a full method name, for example for save changes, I can just type capital S, capital C, and then hit enter. Now I'll create the sessions that will belong to this conference. Next, I'll create the viewConference action method to query the database for the first and only conference and display the result in a view. At this point, the home controller is complete. But before moving on to the view, I want to go back to the top of the file. See the green squigglies in the namespace imports? Those indicate namespaces that are not being used. Now, they aren't preventing the code from running, otherwise the squigglies would be red, but they are distracting. So if I put the cursor on one of them and then click the light bulb, I can choose Remove Unnecessary Usings from the context menu. The unused usings will now disappear. And now I can save the home controller. So there's one last thing. I need to create a view for the action method. So I'm going to go into the Views folder and into Home, and I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it viewconference.cshtml. Now I'm also going to open up the About view and copy its content so that I don't have to type everything out. I'm going to change the title to Conferences. I'm going to delete these two lines, and then I'm going to add a model directive to tell it to expect a model of type conference barrel.models.conference, and then here in the h2 tag I'll tell it to display the name of the conference. Now I'm going to start the application by going back to the command line, back to the root of the project, and then I'm going to start the application by running the command .NET run. I can see that the application is running on localhost and port 5000, so I'll go back to the browser and visit that address. the home page for the application comes up. Now I'll go to Home, Create Conference, and as expected, it redirects to the View Conference action and displays the name of the conference. Now let's go back to the view, and I'm going to add the session titles. Now I'll refresh the page, and there's an error. Let's go back to the terminal and look at the trace. There's a null reference exception somewhere, but where? Well, it turns out that Visual Studio Code can help me again. It has a built-in debugger that can set breakpoints even in web applications. So I'm going to stop the CLI and go back to Visual Studio Code. I'm going to click on this debugger icon on the left. Then I'll open up homecontroller.cs, and I want to see the value of the conference before it is sent into the view. So in the view conference method, I'll set a breakpoint on the return statement. Notice that up here the debugger is set to attach to a web application, and now I can hit the run button. I'll go to the view conference page again. The debugger will stop on the breakpoint, and I can inspect it in the locals, and I can see that the list of sessions is null. Now this is because Entity Framework Core does not eagerly load related collections unless told to. Now fortunately, this is easy to fix. So first I'm going to stop the debugger and go back to the code. The method used to query the sessions is the include method. It will take a lambda expression that tells Entity Framework which collection to load. Now in previous versions of Entity Framework, this is in the system.data.entity namespace, but that namespace, to my knowledge, does not exist in Entity Framework Core. So in Entity Framework Core, that include method is now in Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. So I'll go back up to the top of the file and add a using for that namespace. Now I will go back down to the view conference method and add the method and tell it to include the sessions with each conference. I'll save this, start the debugger again, and once more go to the view conference URL. The debugger will stop again, inspect it. This time there are indeed 3 sessions, which is what we have for this one conference. So I'll stop the application, remove the breakpoint, start the application again, go back to the URL one more time, and see that this time it worked. So we have the name of the conference and the titles of the sessions. I'm going to inspect the database one more time. So I'm going to go back to the bin debug netcore app 1.0 directory and open the database file in SQLite. Now this time I'm going to run a SQL statement, select star from conferences, and we can see the conference that was added, and I'll also write select star from sessions and see the 3 sessions. Of course this was a very simple walkthrough, but hopefully it helped get you started. I had some stumbling points when I was learning this, and I tried to make this clear enough so that others will not have the same problems I did. Feel free to leave me a comment if you have any trouble. And if you enjoyed this and would like to see more, please upvote it and subscribe and share it online. Thanks again for watching.